Well, as you can see, if you look at a traditional garden that's in straight rows, I mean, it's pretty obvious that people have something growing there. So in a grid down situation, an end of the world as we know it scenario, whatever catastrophe, disaster that happens to happen, if you've got a lot of hungry people out there, they're going to be looking for sources of food when they run out. And a traditional row garden is going to be an obvious target because people are going to go, hey, there's food there. And even if there's not food growing there on that plot, they're going to assume that the house that has that garden has food stored there. So this is much more natural looking. It looks like overgrown underbrush. You wouldn't even dream that there's food growing here. If you look at this from a distance, it just all looks camouflaged and you can't tell that you've got crops growing here. So, here we've got grapes, and here we've got peaches and oregano and all the medicinal and cooking herbs and berry bushes. I got a fig tree over there, and it all is just kind of intermingled, intertwined, and people wouldn't realize that you've got food growing here if they were passing by.
Hey, it's Jen with Mad Prepping, and today we have Rick, known as the Survivalist Gardener, with us, and he is a preparedness, homesteading, and off-the-grid living expert. He's the author of The Secret Garden of Survival, which is how to grow a camouflaged food forest, which is now the #1 best-selling book in garden design. Rick is also the author of The Secret Greenhouse of Survival, How to Build the Ultimate Homestead and Prepper Greenhouse, and The Secret Livestock of Survival, How to Raise the 10 Best Choices for Homestead and Retreat Livestock. Rick has been featured on National Geographic's Doomsday Castle, Doomsday Preppers, German TV's Galileo, the documentary film Beyond Off-Grid, as well as in Newsweek, American Survival Guide, and Mother Earth News 3 times. You can also hear Rick on his #1 rated radio show, Secrets of a Survivalist, on the #1 Preparedness Radio Network, where every week he talks with the world's best survival experts that share their own secrets of survival. Welcome, Rick.
Good to be here.
Rick, how did you get into preparedness?
Well, I have been a survivalist and prepper long before they coined the terms. Let me share some photos with you here. I grew up in New Hampshire, where you learn to live with some pretty inclement weather. And, in the wintertime, you could lose power for a week at a time. So you learn to heat with wood, you learn to cook with wood, you learn to take your food out of the refrigerator and store it out in the snow because it's too warm in the house with no refrigeration. So, I've kind of grown up that way and was a Boy Scout, so to speak. And, I learned how to be preparedness minded, like I said, long before there was such a thing as a prepper or survivalist. And I also spent the latter part of my years in Florida in the hurricane and lightning capital of the world. So, there you can learn to live without power for a week at a time, but now you're dealing with 90 degrees and 90% humidity. So, whole different set of circumstances in terms of trying to stay prepared and doing what you need to do. I was an apple farmer in New Hampshire and had apple orchards, and just like everybody else out there, I had the traditional apple farm where you got rows and rows of trees where they're all basically touching each other, and you get one row going that way and one row going that way, and got grass growing in between. And little did I know that the grass sucked up the same nutrients that the apple trees needed. Just like every other conventional orchardist and farmer, I sprayed pesticide every 10 days and after every rain, and I used fertilizer and weed killer, and I still had scabby, wormy apples just like every other apple farmer. I also in Florida, I had citrus groves, so I was kind of doing the same thing, and spraying there, and you get grass growing in between, and still had issues just like everybody else with bad fruit. And I just realized there had to be a better way. There had to be some other way to do this. So I studied nature and experimented and did research and found a much better way to do it.
So what do you know about growing food?
Well, what I found out was that, you know, we haven't always been growing our food the way that we do today. And, you know, in the good old days, back in the early 1900s, everybody grew their own food. So, you know, not only did they grow their own fruit and vegetables, berries and that sort of stuff, they also had their own meat product, their own chickens, their own protein through eggs and other animal foods like milk. And you know, it's only been in recent history that we have kind of turned away from producing our own food. After then came World War II, and everything really changed. Total dynamic changed. Now you had women who were out in the workforce, basically in the factories making bombs and equipment for the war effort, because the men were all overseas fighting the war. So now you had women that were earning a paycheck, and you know, the men were out, and these people, you know, the men had never been outside the farm before, and the women hadn't either. So this really kind of changed things. Then the war was over. And suddenly you had these GIs coming back from overseas. They had seen things they'd never seen before. A lot of them didn't want to go back to the farm. And a lot of the women didn't want to go back to the farm either. They liked earning a paycheck. They liked being independent. So that really was a systemic change for us in terms of everybody producing their own food. And you also had big changes in industry because the folks that were in the military industrial complex and the chemical companies that were making bombs and all that other sort of stuff had this huge infrastructure now, and they had no business. And somebody somehow dumped some of the chemicals on the lawn and food and realized that this stuff that they were using to make bombs would also help plants grow. And so the petrochemical fertilizer industry was born, and you got giants like Monsanto that basically went from making bombs to making fertilizer. And if anybody ever wondered why terrorists use fertilizer to make bombs, it's because it's the same stuff. And originally it was made for bombs, and now they're using it to make fertilizer. I can do a whole show on Monsanto and GMOs and, you know, what they're doing to us and how they're doing it, and the fact that they, you know, it's a revolving door in our government, and they get people that are in the FDA that used to be Monsanto VPs that now approve the work that Monsanto's doing, and, you know, EPA, et cetera. So there's some drain into the swamp that needs to be done there too. So
Oh, absolutely, and we'll save that for the next show. But I'm glad we already have something to go off this.
Yep. So anyway, you know, because there was a change in people's attitudes and what they wanted to do, and because of, you know, these big machines we were able to make, we started doing monocrop farming, where monocrop is basically a single crop in a huge area. And, you know, because they were looking at this as a business and trying to be efficient, they were using machines to plant and harvest large crops in a large area. And they almost kind of needed to do it that way because they just couldn't find the farm hands to do all of this stuff. So since more and more people were not working on the farms and more people had to be fed who were working in cities, you had this mechanized monocrop farming going on that you hadn't had before. And today, you know, we plant for machines and not for people. And it's pretty obvious that this isn't the way things grow in nature. And in order to support all of that, you know, you've got to use all kinds of chemicals. You know, there are no symbiotic relationships. You've got these single crops in this area. There's no diversity, no way to stop pests in a natural way, so they keep piling on more and more chemicals. And you know, that's kind of where I stepped off and said, you know, I was part of this whole problem how do I, where do I go from here?
So how did you get from there learning how to create the secret garden of survival?
Well, as a preparedness-minded person, I wanted to be self-sustaining, and knowing that a future world may be where there's no electricity and no refrigeration and no supermarkets, no seed stores, no fertilizer, no pesticides, no feed stores for domestic farm animals. It just made sense to look at people who had managed to live successfully for generations without any of these conveniences. So as a preparedness-minded person, I wanted to be able to live in a world where we didn't have refrigeration, commercial agriculture. And so what I realized is that, I studied native indigenous people all over the world, and that these folks essentially live off of perennial fruits and nuts. Now, by perennial, we're talking about plants that you plant once and harvest for a lifetime. So, they basically picked fruits and nuts as they went along, and they were, essentially hunter-gatherers. So instead of spending time basically, harvesting or planting crops, they lived off what they call the Neanderthal diet, and they essentially just picked whatever they could off of a tree, and they lived off of small animal proteins. And by small animal proteins, I mean things like rabbits and rodents and fish and snakes and small stuff, not necessarily big game. And so, these people have lived this way for thousands of years, without planting, without weeding, without fertilizer, without pesticide. And, they've managed to survive without any problems whatsoever. So when I looked at what I wanted to do with my garden and my survival plan, that's essentially how I wanted to approach things. So, I began to show this and I started my garden using these concepts. I went from barren red clay to planting every herb in my area that'll grow in my area, every fruit and nut tree that'll grow in my area. And I went from nothing to 12-foot high blackberries in a year, and we had more food than we can eat, without using fertilizer, without using pesticide, without using weed killer. So I was going on the speaking circuit and showing people how I was doing this and how I was providing food for my family. And it basically is like a garden of Eden. It works with nature instead of against it, not using any fertilizer or any pesticide or any weed killer. And, we're growing more food now than we could have ever imagined. So I had so many people looking at what I was doing that, they had asked me time and time again to write a book so they could do it themselves. And that's basically what I did. Is I did that. And within 9 months, The Secret Garden of Survival, How to Grow a Camouflage Food Forest became the #1 bestseller in garden design. And that's not just survival garden design, that is any garden design. And I think the reason is most people like the idea of not having to use pesticide, weed killer, or fertilizer, not even having to water their plants. And, that's my kind of garden, a lot of people were saying. So, that's why I think it's become so popular.
Absolutely. And we've, ladies and gentlemen, been there, seen it, eaten in it. And it's amazing, just absolutely amazing. You really have got to check Rick's book out and learn how to do this for yourself and for your family. So Rick, why is The Secret Garden of Survival so important?
Well, let's say that let's say we're in the end of the world as we know it. And let's say you survive for a year because you got enough food storage to do that. What are you and your livestock going to eat when that food runs out? What's your plan to be able to produce more food? How are you going to replenish that year's food storage each and every year after that? And then almost more importantly, how do you keep others from stealing it? So, I often show these pictures. Let's see, when I'm talking to an audience and I ask them, does this look like a garden? And most people say, yeah, sure, it looks like a garden. They're all in nice straight rows. You can see this is one kind of plant, that's another kind of plant. And, I show them these, and then I show them this picture and ask them if that looks like a garden. And, you know, it just looks like overgrown underbrush. It doesn't. I ask them which produces more food. And the truth of the matter is, this is a food forest, and this actually produces 5 times more food than a traditional garden. And it's also a great hiding in plain sight chance to grow your food, because no one would ever assume that you got food growing there. You know, if you have the zombie hordes coming from the city because there's civil unrest, they're going to be basically going to this garden, and they're going to say, oh, there's food growing there. And even if there's nothing ripe at the time, they're going to assume that that little house over here has got all kinds of food stored in it. So this is a gigantic bullseye on your home, and you know, basically you're going to have these locusts coming and stealing everything that you got. This, on the other hand, looks like somebody abandoned the property.
Right.
Nothing to see here, you know.
Nothing to see. Move along.
Yeah, move along. And so, you know, it's my contention that most people wouldn't even know what food is today unless it was in a package with a label on it. So you can have stuff growing. A lot of people don't even know what it is. So, you know, this is just a great way to hide your food in plain sight. And it is the way nature has grown things for millions of years. You know, this is essentially what I call nature culture. So, you know.
Well, and honestly, when you think about it, all of these things are only one generation removed. I mean, you were talking about World War II and everything else and how our parents were raised. And then we start coming in with the age of convenience. And then we've got microwaves and boxed foods and everything else. And I even asked my mom, I was like, I knew she never canned. I mean, basically all this stuff that I've done has been either self-taught or taking classes. And I asked her, I said, did Grandma ever can? And she was like, oh yeah, Grandma used to can all the time. Well, I mean, so when you think about it, all of these things and these resources are only one generation removed, but look at how far removed it is. It's almost scary. And how we've just become so dependent on convenience, and we're spoiled brats with pushing the Amazon button and it's here in 2 days. And yeah, there may very well be a time that we just don't have that luxury anymore. So tell me, what exactly is the secret garden of survival?
Well, you know, a lot of people refer to this using the term permaculture, which means permanent agriculture. But, you know, what we're doing here is much more than that. And permaculture has become such a bastardized term used for so many things. It's just really, it's a marketing term today. I mean, I look at stuff that people are calling permaculture, and they are nothing like what I would call it. So I came up with this term called nature culture because it's the way that nature's been growing things for millions of years. It's essentially, you're planting once, you're harvesting for a lifetime. You let nature do what nature does best. In my opinion, man screws it up every time he thinks he can do it better. Instead of planting, you know, every year in rows, you create food that you plant once and harvest for a lifetime. You plant things together that create a symbiotic relationship. So, for example, if you've ever read the book Carrots Love Tomatoes, if you plant carrots and tomatoes together, they do better together than they do by themselves. There's a symbiotic relationship there. Well, this is really that for a whole ecosystem. So it goes way, way beyond just certain vegetables. You use plants to attract good bugs that'll kill the bad bugs that you don't want to have on your plants. So I've got a plant in my garden called Mountain Mint, and that is constantly covered with these predatory wasps that kill the bad bugs that you don't want to have in your other plants. And if you plant things right, you can create this kind of perimeter of defense around your other fruit, using plants like that and other herbs that are flowering all the time. So, you know, you're bringing those predators in, and the bad bugs got to get past the predators to get to your fruit. So it's a great way to use natural pesticide. And, you know, also this, since I've got stuff flowering all the time, these little white flowers here are all blackberries, and this is all looking down the hill. I've got bees, and they're providing honey for me. And since they have a very short trip from their hive to my garden, the more trips they make, the more honey they produce. and we're producing 60 pounds of honey per hive per year.
That's amazing.
Honey is nature's perfect food.
Mhm.
It's a great medicine as well. You can use it internally, externally. They still don't know all of the great benefits that honey has. So, it's just one of those things that we've got that we are, that's helping us prepare, because you can preserve with it, you cook with it, and use an awful lot of honey on food and that kind of stuff.
And medicinally.
If you there's other symbiotic relationships, like if you plant onions or garlic around the base of a tree, mice won't go near that tree in the wintertime and girdle the tree and destroy your tree. If you plant daffodils around the drip line of a tree, deer won't go near it. People ask me all the time, well, you've got this forest within this forest and you've got deer, how do you keep them away? And one of the other great things is planting rosemary. Rosemary will keep deer away. They don't like the smell of it. They stay away from it. So, I've got this food forest with all kinds of food and fruit that deer would normally be ravaging, and they stay completely away from it without my having to do anything.
Wow. That is just amazing.
One of the other things that makes it different is that, you're not planting in rows. You're essentially planting in concentric circles. So this is the way nature grows things. In nature, you've got a tree that starts out small, it grows up and out. Eventually there's a canopy underneath that tree, there's shade underneath it, there's certain plants that will grow, under that canopy in the shade, and there's a symbiotic relationship between the tree and those plants there. Then you've got full sun outside of that canopy. So now you've got your shrub layer. So that's things like your blueberries, your blackberries, your elderberries. And then outside of that, you get full sun again, and that's where your herb layer is. And that is your defensive perimeter, because your herbs are flowering all the time. They're attracting those predatory wasps. They're attracting the pollinators that pollinate your fruit. And the bad bugs have to get through this and past that to get to your fruit area. So this is really your natural pesticide, and this is the way nature has been working for millions of years. Outside of that, you get ground cover, and that can be anything from clover, which has medicinal benefits for you too. You can eat it, to buckwheat, alfalfa. All of those are nitrogen fixers that actually put nitrogen back into the soil. So they take it from the air, they put it into the soil, the other plants can use that, and ultimately that's your natural fertilizer. You've also got a vine layer too. And, it's interesting is that vines naturally grow on trees. There are no trellises in nature. Before man started using trellises, grapes were growing on trees, and that's just how they grow. They actually do better on trees than they do on trellises. Here's a picture of grapes. Now, these are Concord grapes. They're not ripe yet, and apples growing together on an apple tree. And, so I'm also able to harvest more fruit in the same area, because this is the way things grow in nature. And so many people have said, oh, it's going to kill the tree, it's going to choke out the tree. No. The grapes actually like mottled sun better than full sun, and they do better together than they do by themselves. So, this is essentially the way things grow in nature. Everything looks wild and overgrown. It's kind of like the art of camouflage. You can't tell anything's there. It all blends in. There's no definable shapes. And this is a great photograph to illustrate that. Here we've got mountain mint that I talked about before. Awesome. Here we've got some peppermint here. You can see there's little pears here. It's just getting started. This is a comfrey, which is a great internal and external medicinal herb. You can use this if you've got a cut. You can put it on as a compress, and it'll stop the bleeding. It's also a great plant from a symbiotic relationship with the rest of the plants here, because it has a 30-foot taproot. It reaches down 30 feet and pulls up minerals like calcium, magnesium, that sort of stuff that the other plants can't reach, and brings them up to the soil so those plants can use those as well.
Wow.
And, we've got a lot of stuff growing in this little area that you may or may not be able to see, but I'm going to encourage your viewers to take a look and see if they can find the watermelon in this picture.
Ah, forget Waldo. Where's the watermelon? So tell us. I'm sorry.
It's right here. And I don't know if you can see that or not, but there's a watermelon right there. And so it's growing right in front of you. I said, can you find the watermelon? And most people can't even see it.
Mm-hmm.
So these are all growing together. They're all doing better together than they would by themselves. Nobody's fighting with each other. Everybody's sharing stuff. It's a great liberal world here. Everybody shares. Everybody does well. They all get along, coexist, all that stuff. So.
Well, tell us what the Secret Garden of Survival is not.
Well, let me just show one more thing here.
Oh.
This is a little 2 foot by 2 foot square in my garden. And here's the mountain mint. Here's comfrey. Here's mint. These are peanuts right here. That's another nitrogen fixer. This is cucumber. There's also I think you can see some peas or beans over here. And the little things that look like grass, there's actually oats. So, we can harvest the oats and use those in our own food, or, you can serve this oat grass to my goats who love that stuff. And there's basically passion fruit growing here. So this is all in a 2 foot by 2 foot square in my garden. The entire garden is like this. So, there's food growing everywhere, and you just wouldn't know it if you don't recognize what these plants are. So this is the way it works. And this is one of the peach trees. I did a video on this last year, and I got 1,000 peaches off of this one single tree.
Wow.
And it is beautiful fruit, no fertilizer, no pesticide, no weed killer. It was so heavy that the branches are hanging down. And, I picked, the video shows me picking in less than an hour, 15 gallons of fruit. Now, it's just amazing the production that happens in this garden. And as it gets older and more mature, it's 6-7 years old now, the trees get bigger, they could produce more fruit. So, we've got a lot of food for ourselves and for our prepper group. And the biggest issue I have is my wife's ire when I'm bringing in 6 to 12 gallons of fruit every single day. And about halfway through the summer, she screams, "Stop! I can't."
Yeah, I remember the figs a few years ago.
Frantically canning, frantically trying to dehydrate, frantically trying to preserve the stuff. And unfortunately, we do have to use the freezer and put a lot of this stuff in the freezer. And then, when things slow down later in the fall, we're able to, pick back up and put all this stuff away. But I have to give her a lot of credit, because there are days that she's working 18 hours a day in the kitchen trying to preserve this stuff just so that we can save the food. So, but this is what they used to do in the old days too. So
absolutely, and then you don't have to grocery shop and think of the money you're saving there. This just plant
absolutely
done.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you were asking me what the survival, what the garden is not, and basically all you do is harvest. You don't weed, you don't fertilizer down, you don't use pesticide, and every day I go out for an hour in the morning and I'm bringing in 6 to 12 gallons worth of fruit, and it just depends on what's in season. I walk down through the garden, and one day there'll be something that's ripe and I pick that, and there's other stuff that isn't ripe right next to it. Now that's totally different than commercial gardening, where they pick everything all at once. They pump it full of chemicals, they turn it to the color it's supposed to be, and that's what you are buying on your grocery store shelves. This, we're only picking the stuff that's ripe when it's ripe, and the next day I go out there and the stuff that wasn't ripe yesterday is ripe today, so I just pick that. So we're picking perfect fruit every day, and that's what's going up and being preserved, and that's what we're consuming. So it's also not weeding. I mentioned that. I like to say weeds are just misunderstood plants. You know, they're not snowflakes, but they're just misunderstood. Everybody wants to pick weeds, and you know, weeds are a pioneer plant. They go in where nothing else will grow. They will break up hard clay soil, and they will allow air and water and microbes to get in. And ultimately, they're a succession plant. So they're the first plant in the succession. Eventually, they die back. They create food for the next series of plants, and then other stuff can grow there. So anybody that's picking weeds is actually stopping the cycle at step one. And when you do that, you're making it much, much harder for yourself. So the other neat thing is that, you know, weeds to you are feed to me, because I can cut this stuff off, not pulling it up by the roots, but just cutting it off, and I throw it over for my goats, and it makes nice food for them. And I've got bees that are constantly, because weeds are essentially flowering all the time, my bees have food all the time, so they can make much more food for me. And you know, I like to tell people that I provide the bees with housing. I'm the landlord, and twice a year I go collect the rent.
That's
And,
right.
you know, that's the deal. So ultimately, you know, this provides them with food year round, so I don't have to provide them with food, and it makes it completely sustainable. So it's not using pesticide. You know, 90% of bugs out there are good, beneficial bugs in one way or another. And ultimately, if you understand, you know, the food chain, there are fewer predators than there are prey. And when you kill the predators first, the good bugs, you end up having prey go unchecked. So now you've got bad bugs, and they grow exponentially. So, and you know, you got to think, where are you going to get pesticide anyway after the end of the world as we know it? So, likewise, you know, with fertilizer, you know, when you feed your plants fertilizer, it's like giving them a drug, and then you create a drug addict, and they become dependent on it. So it's better not to have that stuff to start with, and just use the way nature's been doing it for, you know, millions of years. So that is the secret garden today. So
That is just amazing, hon.
there's me right there.
Yeah, there's Rick.
And all of this is food. You know, you just don't recognize it as food. So, and again, you know, it's like the Garden of Eden. This is the way things have been growing for millions of years.
Well, and plus, even if Teotihuacan doesn't even happen, you know, think about it. You know, when you grow it yourself, it tastes so much better. It's better for you. It's got more nutrients. It's not just like watered down vegetables. This is good stuff. And the way you do it, you're not having to go out and weed and feed and water and everything else. And so if people can get this down and get it started, it's going to supply them for the rest of their lives. And it's amazing.
Right.
What are some of the other benefits of planting like this, Rick?
Well, you know, when you mentioned that there being more nutrition, it's absolutely true, because, you know, what I'm growing is basically grown on virgin land, as opposed to the stuff that has been farmed over and over and over and over again, the commercial farming. And if you look at the nutrient content in food that you buy in the grocery store today versus the grocery store food that you bought in the 1960s,
Mm-hmm.
there is 3 times more food in the 1960s grocery store than there are 3 times more nutrients in that food in the 1960s than there is today. So we basically have 1/3 the nutrients that we did in the 1960s. So, you know, the interesting thing is that our bodies are telling us that we are starving. So is it any wonder that we are the most obese society on the planet, when we keep eating and eating and eating and eating because our bodies are telling us we're not getting the nutrients we need? And you know, that's what's happening to us. So, you know, the food is much better. It provides you with all the food, you know, vegetables, nuts, and berries that you can consume. There's also no need for watering. You know, people don't realize that the best place to store water is in the ground. And when you have basically perennial fruits and vegetables, they have a chance to get roots that are longer. They can withstand droughts. They can withstand too much heat, too little heat. You know, they're basically able to handle a lot of other stuff. And when we set up our garden, we created these little swales. So, guess what? When it rains, water runs downhill. And so we've got these little terraces here, and then we've created these little berms on the end of the terraces, and water runs downhill, it settles right here, and then it just kind of sinks into the ground. And what you end up having is these lens-shaped pools of water underneath your berms. So the plants that you have planted here can all reach that. And, we've had where we are, droughts for 6 weeks at a time in the summertime. And I happen to be, up on a mountaintop. And as Jen knows, I look down on my neighbors in more ways than one. And, I can see all their plants are dead in July. They're all dead and brown, and mine are green and lush. I'm not doing any watering whatsoever. So, this is how, again, you can grow on an area like I have, where it's on the side of a mountain essentially, and no one in their right mind would look at putting a conventional garden there, because the water would just run downhill, and you'd have all kinds of erosion problems, and you couldn't feed the plants. So we don't do that. And this kind of illustrates the terraces. Everything just kind of went downhill here, and we cut these terraces in. I hired a guy with a backhoe, and he did this in 10 hours at $30 an hour. It was $300 to do half an acre and put these terraces in. And that was as simple as that. Now, we left the rocks in place. Interestingly, the rocks are like a thermal mass. So they heat up during the day and they give off heat at night. And this gives me a much longer growing season, because I don't have to worry about early frost in the fall or late frost in the spring. And, the plants that I plant next to the rocks are warmer, and, they're all over the land here. So, it's just another way that we can do this. And, the proof is in the pudding, as they say. We went from, this is an apple tree, and this is a little grape that we planted. You can see we planted them right next to each other. And we went from that. This is the same grape on the apple tree in 2 years.
Wow.
So in 2 years, we went from that to that with no fertilizer, no pesticide, no weed killer. This is basically looking down the hill on my garden, and all of this stuff is fruit. All of these are going to be blackberries, these little white things. So that's the way it looks. And, it's also a great perimeter defense for you too, because if you've ever walked through a blackberry patch, planted on the edges of the garden, and nothing wants to go through it, including, not only four-legged predators, but two-legged predators too.
Mm-hmm. Got to look out for both.
Yeah.
So what are the different things that you talk about in your book?
Well, I tried to make it as simple as possible. In a lot of ways, it's a picture book, because I was in the marketing and advertising business, when I was in the corporate world, and I realized that very few people read copy. Most people look at pictures and read captions and read headlines. So I kind of designed it that way. And because I was able to take pictures while I was doing this whole process, there was a lot of content there that I could use. So essentially, there's a lot of pictures, and it shows you, illustrates how to do it. When I was talking to publishers about doing this, I told them I wanted to do it color pictures. Everybody says I was nuts. It's going to be too expensive. So I did it anyway. I did it through Amazon myself. And it's all color pictures. There's like 140 pictures in there. So if in fact a picture's worth 1,000 words, I've saved you from reading 140,000 words.
Wow.
Basically I show you how to do everything, how to start with a clean slate, take barren existing ground. I show you how to put a gray water system in, where you can use gray water, from your house, to irrigate your crops to start with if you need to. I show you how to build these little permaculture guilds, these little ecosystems, and how to plant them. I even show you how to dig a hole, the proper way to dig a hole so it's going to fit the root ball, and how you can plant 3 plants together in that same hole and they'll share nutrients through their roots.
Well, and that's so important because so many people just dig a hole, stick it in, then walk away, and they don't take care of it, and they wonder why their plant dies.
Yep. So it's, it really goes through, a simplistic way to do this. I read books on permaculture that were 400 pages long, that were written by scientists that you couldn't understand. And, I've tried to make it as simple as possible, because for me, this is all about saving your family, saving yourself, saving your prepper group, and, being able to survive after the end of the world as we know it. Or, in our case, we're just, living really, really well, and being off the grid, not just off the grid from an electric standpoint or from a working standpoint, but we're off the grid from a industrial food standpoint. So, I did this with Secret Garden of Survival, and I created a greenhouse where I'm growing food year round using a lot of the same concepts. And that greenhouse also heats my home and heats my hot water all year long. And that's another book, The Secret Greenhouse of Survival. And, the third leg on the stool, so to speak, is the protein side of things. And so, I have 60 animals now on this very, very small piece of property. I use a lot of the same concepts. They're hiding in plain sight. I don't have cows for milk because they require 2.5 to 5 acres per cow to produce milk, and that's open land. So here, another bullseye, here I am, come get me. So I've got little Nigerian dwarf dairy goats that don't even come up to my knee, and 3 of them at any one time will produce 1.5 gallons of milk a day. So, we make cheese and, yogurt and everything, all the dairy products from that. I've got ducks that roam my garden, and they eat the bugs and slugs and snails that I don't want to have on my plants. They clean up things that drop that I can't get to, like berries or grapes and that kind of stuff. And so they're feeding off the garden, and they produce protein for me. And oh, by the way, as they go along, they drop fertilizer too. So, there's that kind of symbiotic relationship. And essentially, that's what I've done here. And between my Secret Garden of Survival, my Secret Greenhouse of Survival, and my Secret Livestock of Survival books, it shows you an entire food production system that you can use, whether you're a prepper, wanting to do something for your retreat, or you're a homesteader just wanting to live a better life and eat better food, and not be on the industrial food grid, and not be beholden to those folks. Because as anybody that's been to the grocery store knows, the packages are getting smaller and smaller, and the prices are getting bigger and bigger, and eventually everything you do, all the work you do, all the money you make is going to go to paying for your food to just survive. So, and if that happens, you are a slave and a prisoner to the system.
Well, and I've even heard the so-called organics people are buying from the grocery store are picked before they're ripe, and then everything has to go through a procedure where they're sprayed to start the ripening process again.
Yeah, organic is a lie. I mean, everybody's doing it again. It's a marketing thing. To find anything that's truly organic is almost impossible. So you really need to be growing your own stuff. And why shouldn't you be? Because ultimately it doesn't take a lot of space. Everything that I showed you here is grown on less than half an acre. I got people that have bought my book that are doing this in subdivisions where there's a homeowners association where they weren't allowing them to grow a garden because somebody in their, not in their right mind said, oh, gardens are ugly, you can't have a garden. So, they're basically growing fruit trees and berries, and, it just looks like ornamental shrubbery to anybody else. And, they're not going to keep them from planting trees and bushes. So, anybody can do this and get started.
Well, and the biggest thing is, even if, like you said, we aren't getting the chemicals in our bodies, and it's like, I know in one of your chapters, you start talking about the natural pest control. And that's something that's very important, because there's so much cancer and childhood obesity and everything else, and diabetes that's feeding into all this. So I'm really intrigued by the natural pest control side of it. Well,
yeah, and now I show you how to away from four-legged pests and six-legged pests and that sort of stuff. I mean, I had a point where we were throwing out seed, trying to grow some oats, and I get squirrels here, like most people do, and I watch them from my windows. And every time I turned my back, they would run down and steal some of my seeds. And so we figured out that if you spray dry pepper flakes, hot peppers around there, they won't go near it. So, there's a way to keep them from robbing your fruit, whether that's blueberries or you're, stealing your seeds just by putting some hot pepper stuff down there. I show you how to, get rid of fire ants. I've got a video that's got, thousands and thousands and thousands of views by basically just using stuff that you would have in food storage. So, you can use molasses and some other ingredients, and that will kill fire ants. So, I'm showing you how to essentially do all this stuff with the things that you would normally have as a prepper, that you have in food storage or what you're growing in your garden. So you don't have to be buying these chemicals and don't have to be consuming these chemicals. You're better off. Your food's better off. Your livestock is better off that's living off your garden too. And, you don't have to be beholden to the industrial food grid.
Well, and that's awesome, because I know we planted our peach trees about 4 years ago, and we've started getting some peaches, but we'd see them on there, and then all of a sudden they were all gone. And finally, hubby and I were leaving one day to go somewhere, and he just starts speaking in tongues, and I'm like, what? And he's got this, he looks over and points to the squirrel running off with our last peach that we hadn't gotten any of, because we don't get 1,000 peaches like you do. So this is another reason why it's so important to start bringing these procedures in and doing this. So, so what have you tried to accomplish by writing this book, Rick?
Well, really, I just tried to do what people asked me to do when I was on the speaking circuit. I've tried to show people how they can do it themselves, tried to make it really simple, really easy, so that they can survive and be off the food grid just like I am. And, the techniques work. They work amazingly well. It's basically you're letting nature do what nature has done for millions of years without man interfering, and just a little coaching, a little coaxing. And, if you follow the tips in this book, you'll be able to do the same thing that I did, because it's simple. It really is simple.
Well, and that's what we need. And is there anything else that you want to summarize for our listeners as we're wrapping up?
Well, if you do the things that were in this book, in The Secret Garden of Survival, you'll be able to, create your own Garden of Eden, really, that works with nature instead of against it. And perhaps most important of all, your garden will be look like nature. And if we ever have a end of the world as we know it scenario, or whatever disaster happens to be happening, whether it's regional, local, or nationwide, no one's going to be able to know that you got food growing there, and you'll be a lot safer as a result.
Absolutely. And even for those that aren't really into the preparedness, but they want the health and the convenience, and when you think about it, you've got all of this stuff that's healthy. You've got basically a one and done with most of these items, and it's just so much better for you. And so where can we get your books, Rick?
Well, you can get them on Amazon. They're in a Kindle version. They're in a hard copy version. You can get them at Barnes & Noble for the Nook format. And you can find really all that information out at my website, which is secretgardenofsurvival.com. If you want to contact me, you can do it through Twitter, Facebook, Google+, YouTube. I got all kinds of YouTube videos that show you a lot more detail of the garden as it's grown over time, and lots of tips and tricks about that too, so the YouTube channel. But you can find all of those links, all of that social media stuff, on my website, which is secretgardenofsurvival.com.
Well, that's Rick, I just want to thank you so much. You are just so knowledgeable and you have so much to share. And this is what this is all about. So thank you so much. And I look forward to having you on here again to talk about some other great things.
Sounds good. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Y'all be safe, take care, and keep on prepping.
Will do.